The moment the story begins, it doesn't start with a headline, a leaked photo, or even a whispered rumor. It starts with something far more powerful. A question. A question that sliced straight through the quiet of a California evening and sent shockwaves rippling through a marriage already carrying more fractures than anyone on the outside could see. Did you sleep with Andrew? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. There are sentences that sting. There are sentences that bruise. And then there are sentences that leave a crater. This one was the kind that didn't just land, it detonated. And when those 6 words came out of Prince Harry's mouth, the room didn't just fall silent, it froze. A silence so sharp it could cut skin. A silence Meghan Markle never thought she would hear from the man who had once insisted he trusted her against the entire world. But why now? Why that specific question? Why that specific name? And why with such explosive intensity that even royal insiders, who had lived through decades of palace drama, said they had never seen Harry this rattled, this unsteady, this cornered by emotion? To understand that, we need to go back not days, not weeks, but decades. Because this story isn't just about a rumor, or a yacht, or Andrew. It's about something deeper, something older, something the royal family has tried to control, bury, reshape, and deny for generations. Their fear of scandals that begin quietly, but end catastrophically. And this one began so quietly you could almost miss it. It began with Sarah Ferguson. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever been in a room where someone lowers their voice? Not because they're unsure, but because they know the power of a whisper? That's what made this moment so dangerous. Fergie didn't shout. She didn't accuse. She didn't even speak in a tone that suggested she wanted trouble. According to royal insiders, she simply made an offhand remark. Just a slight nudge. A drop of information delivered into the wrong ear at exactly the right time. Or the wrong time, depending on who you ask. And that nudge, that whisper, was enough to unearth a story Meghan Markle thought had been so deeply buried under the glitz, glamour, and carefully curated PR statements of her Hollywood years that no one, especially not someone inside the royal family, would ever bring it up again. But Sarah Ferguson did. She didn't need to say much. She didn't need to name dates, people, or places. All she needed to say was something that hinted, something that implied, something that suggested a connection between Meghan Markle's alleged yacht past and a circle of people she never wanted tied to her name again, especially not Prince Andrew. And that suggestion spread like wildfire. Because here's the truth. In royal circles, silence isn't empty. It's heavy. And whispers aren't small. They're nuclear. The second Sarah Ferguson's comment left her lips, it didn't just enter the air. It entered the bloodstream of an already fragile monarchy. It traveled to the staff, who heard it accidentally, to the advisor who repeated it intentionally, to the assistant who mentioned it in the wrong hallway, and finally, to the one person whose reaction Sarah Ferguson likely never intended to ignite. Prince Harry. But before the eruption, let me pull you deeper into the atmosphere surrounding this moment. Because this wasn't happening in isolation. This wasn't just a random day in Montecito. This confrontation, this whisper, this rumor didn't arrive in a vacuum. It arrived in a world where Harry and Meghan were already spiraling. Remember the Netflix fallout? The ongoing scrutiny over Archewell? The strained relationship with the palace? The financial pressures? The growing distance between Meghan and the very Hollywood circle she once leaned on? The air around them was already thick with tension, thick with accusations, thick with doubt. Harry was dealing with his own anxieties, his reputation, his fading relevance, his strained connection to his brother, the dwindling sympathy from the public, and the question he woke up with every morning. Where did everything go wrong? So when this rumor, this one rumor, reached him, it didn't land on calm soil. It landed on dry grass, already waiting for a spark. But whether you believe Sarah Ferguson knew exactly what she was doing or whether she was simply being Fergie, unfiltered, impulsive, and dangerously honest, one thing is certain. She said the one thing Meghan Markle feared most. That her past wasn't past. That her reinvention wasn't solid. That the version of herself she presented to the world had cracks. And those cracks were beginning to show. And if Meghan felt exposed, you can imagine what Harry felt. Let me ask you something else. Have you ever loved someone so intensely that the thought of them hiding something, Anything feels like a betrayal, not because the truth is necessarily catastrophic, but because the secrecy is. That's what Harry was dealing with. He wasn't reacting to the rumor. He was reacting to years of doubts he never expressed. Moments of confusion he pushed aside. Comments from his family he tried to ignore. Public criticism he insisted wasn't true. He was reacting to the possibility. Just the possibility that maybe he didn't know everything. And that's the thing about trust. It's not broken by facts. It's broken by fear. So when he confronted Meghan, he wasn't just asking whether she had a connection to Prince Andrew. He was asking something bigger, something far more painful. Do I really know who you were before me? And that question hit Meghan like a bullet. Because if there's one thing Meghan Markle has built her career on, long before the royal wedding, long before Suits, long before the humanitarian speeches, it's image. A carefully sculpted, meticulously maintained, strategically crafted image of a woman who climbed everything, earned everything, achieved everything with grace, intelligence, discipline, and intention. But the thing about images is this. When one crack appears, it doesn't just exist. It spreads. And now, in the span of seconds, the image she curated for years, the image she fought for, was suddenly being questioned by the one person she needed most to believe in it. That's why her response wasn't calm. It wasn't strategic. It wasn't measured. It was emotional, instant, explosive. Because fear can turn even the strongest person into someone unrecognizable. But here's where this introduction shifts. Because you might think the story starts with Harry's confrontation. You might think the question about Andrew is what triggered everything. But you'd be wrong. What triggered everything happened days earlier, behind closed palace doors in London. A quiet moment. A casual exchange. A single sentence that seemed unimportant at the time, until it wasn't. Because the real chaos didn't begin in Montecito. It began in Buckingham Palace. Inside a private conversation between Sarah Ferguson and someone who rarely entertains gossip. Princess Anne. Imagine that for a second. Princess Anne, the most no-nonsense, straight-backed, stone-faced royal of the entire family, listening. Listening to something she had no interest in. Something she didn't approve of. Something that made her say only one thing. That will not end well. And she was right. Because from the moment Anne heard Sarah Ferguson's comment, the story began moving like a current beneath the surface. Silent, unseen, but unstoppable. By the time it reached Prince Harry, it wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a storm fueled by old photographs, half-truths, resurfaced rumors, desperate PR moves, jealous Hollywood voices, and a royal family who decided, for once, not to protect Meghan. A storm that pushed Harry toward a confrontation that would change everything. A storm that sent Meghan spiraling into panic. Not because she had something to hide, but because she knew the royal family was finally doing something she feared, letting a rumor grow instead of killing it. And when Harry whispered that sentence, the one sentence that no husband, no partner, no protector ever wants to ask, "Did you sleep with Andrew?" Meghan knew the storm had reached her door. But here's the thing. Here's what you're not expecting. That question, that explosive moment, that confrontation, it wasn't the real beginning. It was merely the fuse. Because what came next? The message Harry received, the photo he saw, the testimony that emerged, and the palace meeting no one expected, would unravel everything. And no one saw it coming. It started with a whisper. Not a scream. Not a confrontation. Not a dramatic expose in the press. A whisper. The kind that doesn't need volume to shake an entire institution. And the most shocking part? Sarah Ferguson didn't even mean for it to spread. Or maybe she did. Because with Fergie, you never truly know. She's unpredictable, spontaneous, dangerously candid, and yet strategic enough to know exactly how a single line, dropped casually at the right moment, can ricochet through the royal world like a bullet. Picture this, a small gathering inside the York family's private corridor at Royal Lodge. Not an official meeting, not a scheduled event, just a moment where royal relatives lingered after a quiet discussion about upcoming charity engagements. Staff members close enough to hear murmurs, but far enough to pretend they weren't listening. And that's when it happened. Sarah Ferguson leaned in slightly, not to be dramatic, but simply because that's how she talks when she's about to say something personal. She tilted her head, lowered her voice, and released the sentence that would become the spark of a transatlantic explosion. I remember Meghan from the old circles, the yacht circles. Just 11 words. Barely audible, but devastating. Now, before going deeper, let me ask you something directly. Have you ever witnessed a moment where a person says something in a tone so casual, so effortless, that you almost don't realize how explosive it is until 5 minutes later? You know that feeling, the delayed detonation. The realization that what you heard wasn't small at all. It was massive. That's what happened. Because anyone who knows royal history knows why that sentence was deadly. The words, yacht circles, don't float lightly around the Windsor family. They carry implications, associations, shadows, especially considering who has been historically tied, rightly or wrongly, to certain yacht gatherings. And if there's a name that sits uncomfortably close to that topic, Prince Andrew. Now imagine being one of the staff members in that hallway, hearing Fergie's whisper, and feeling your stomach drop. Not because of Meghan, not because of the rumor itself, but because of who was speaking. Sarah Ferguson has always walked a fine line between insider and outcast. She knows things. She hears things. She was once deeply embedded in the wild social circles of the 80s and 90s. The parties, the famous faces, the private gatherings, the networking that blurred into something else entirely. She has seen more than she ever publicly admits. So when she insinuates a connection between Meghan Markle's past and those circles, you better believe people notice. And they did. One advisor nearby stiffened. A staffer paused mid-step. Someone else exchanged a look that said everything without a single word. This wasn't harmless gossip. This wasn't a random comment. This was political dynamite. Because Meghan wasn't just a former actress anymore. Meghan was a duchess, a wife, a mother, a symbol, and any suggestion, even the faintest, tying her to controversial social circles would have severe implications for the monarchy's already fragile reputation. So why did Fergie say it? That's the million-dollar question. Sarah Ferguson has always been a wild card, the kind of royal relative who means well, but often speaks without thinking. But there's another possibility, a darker one that palace insiders have whispered about for years. Revenge. Remember, Meghan distanced herself from certain royals after leaving the family. She sharpened her commentary about her experience. She named names. She hinted at racism, exclusion, cruelty, some of which implicated the older generation of royals, including people close to Fergie. And Fergie doesn't forget. She spent decades clawing her way back from scandals, financial disasters, tabloid humiliation. She watched newer royals receive sympathy she was never offered. She watched Meghan reposition herself as the outsider wronged by the monarchy. A position Sarah herself once occupied. Jealousy? Resentment? Recognition? Payback? You decide. But here's what we know for sure. Her whisper was intentional enough to be dangerous, but subtle enough to be deniable. And this is where the story begins to shift. Because someone else was listening. Princess Anne. Now imagine that. Princess Anne, the stoic one. The disciplined one. The royal with a backbone made of iron and a tolerance for nonsense so low it's practically at sea level. She wasn't supposed to be part of that hallway moment. She had simply passed through on her way to another meeting. But she heard it. And if Sarah Ferguson's whisper was the spark, Anne's reaction was the oxygen, and stopped walking, that alone was unusual. Princess Anne doesn't pause for whispers. She doesn't indulge in speculation. She doesn't participate in palace gossip. She shuts it down. So when she stopped, even for a second, the entire room felt it. She turned slightly toward Fergie, eyebrows lifting in a way that could silence a room full of diplomats. And in that voice she uses only when something is deeply concerning, she said, "That will not end well." 7 words. Cold, calm, predictive. The kind of sentence that doesn't come from curiosity, but from experience. And that's when Fergie realized she'd gone too far. And didn't look amused. She didn't look shocked. She looked disappointed. Which, for Princess Anne, is worse than anger. The moment ended quickly, with Anne walking away and Fergie pretending nothing significant had been said. But the damage was done. In palace culture, nothing spreads faster than a rumor overheard by the wrong royal. By the next morning, the whisper had traveled. A senior aide repeated it to a colleague. A footman mentioned it in passing during a break. Someone brought it up to a communications officer. And before long, It reached a private advisor to King Charles. And that advisor made the critical mistake of not burying it. That's when things escalated. Because the royal machine is built on one principle: silence scandals early or they spread like wildfire. And this one wasn't just spreading, it was attaching itself to existing fractures within the monarchy. Andrew's ongoing reputation crisis, Harry and Meghan's estrangement, public distrust of the royal family, the never-ending debate about Meghan's past. The perception that the monarchy had lost control. The timing couldn't have been worse. And here's where the story crosses the ocean. Because while all this was happening, the whispers, the reactions, the private discussions, Meghan and Harry had no idea. They were in California, living their separate routines, managing their projects, navigating their tension-filled marriage quietly and privately. The storm was forming behind their backs, and they had no clue. But if the palace was the place where the spark ignited, Montecito was where the fire would land. Because one person, just one, made a choice that changed everything. A junior staffer, worried about how far the rumor had traveled, reached out to someone close to Harry. Not to stir trouble, not to expose Meghan, but because sometimes staff act on instinct, and this staffer had a terrible feeling about how quickly the story was escalating. Maybe Harry should be aware, they said. And just like that, the whisper crossed the Atlantic. Imagine Harry opening that message. He wasn't expecting drama. He wasn't anticipating chaos. But he read the words, yacht circles, Sarah Ferguson, and Meghan in the same sentence. And something in him snapped. Not in anger. Not yet. In fear. Because Harry has always been paranoid about scandals. Not because he cares about the monarchy's image, but because he knows firsthand how a narrative can destroy a person's life. He saw it happen to his mother. He lived it in the tabloids. He experienced it with Meghan. So when he saw this whisper forming into something larger, he felt panic creep in. What if this spirals? What if the press hears it? What if it attaches to Andrew's ongoing scandals? What if Meghan becomes the new target? Those were his first thoughts. But then something else took over. Doubt. Not because he believed the rumor, but because a question surfaced in his mind that had been hiding there for years. Why didn't Meghan ever fully explain certain parts of her past? Not because she was hiding something, but because she avoided certain topics, deflected certain questions, minimized certain connections. Meghan had always been selective about her pre-royal world, and Harry, blinded by love, never pushed. Until now. That's what Sarah Ferguson's whisper did. It pushed a question to the surface Harry never wanted to ask. A question that would burn everything in its path. But what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming that it's not every day that princess speaks. And when she does, everyone listens. Her voice doesn't carry dramatics or theatrics. It carries weight. Authority. The kind of authority built over decades of meticulous discipline, unwavering loyalty, and a rare, uncanny ability to cut through nonsense with a single glance. So, when Sarah Ferguson noticed and pausing in the corridor, eyebrows furrowed, lips pursed, she knew instantly that what she had just whispered was no longer just an idle comment. It had evolved into something far more dangerous. Something that could unravel months of careful damage control before Harry even knew it existed. Imagine that moment. Two women, one a former scandal-ridden duchess, the other a stoic, untouchable princess, standing face to face in a quiet palace hallway. A few aides lingered discreetly, pretending not to eavesdrop, yet acutely aware that the air was electric. Every word mattered. Every pause counted. Fergie, ever the social operator, leaned slightly closer. You think she's clean, don't you? But I've seen things. Circles. Parties. Yachts. Names that no one should ever mix, she murmured, careful to keep her tone neutral, almost casual. Anne's eyes narrowed. She had heard enough in those few seconds to understand the implications. She wasn't reacting to Meghan's past. She wasn't judging her. She was calculating, measuring, weighing the consequences not just for Harry and Meghan, but for the monarchy itself. Anne's response was brief. This will not end well, she said, crisp, measured. But beneath that restraint was a depth of foresight that few could match. She knew the palace, the media, the public, and the tabloids would seize on any hint of impropriety. And if Fergie's whisper ever became more than a whisper, it would be unstoppable. Fergie, never one to back down, tilted her head slightly, smirking, as though daring, and to scold her. And didn't engage with the smirk. She just watched, silently, and that silence carried more power than any word could. And raised an eyebrow. That one gesture alone conveyed volumes. For the aides nearby, it was a warning sign. For Fergie, it was a silent acknowledgement, and knew this was serious. But what made the situation volatile was what neither woman said. The unspoken words, the glances, the half-smiles, the pause between sentences. Everything implied the stakes were high. And in the royal world, stakes this high are never just about individuals. They are about legacy, reputation, and survival. And leaned closer and lowered her voice. Sarah, do you understand what could happen if this spreads? Her tone wasn't accusatory. It was cautionary, measured, deliberate. A subtle hint that the palace machinery could move swiftly and not always in Meghan's favor. Fergie's response was almost playful, masking the sharp edge beneath. I only said what I remembered. I didn't mean to cause a war. And wasn't convinced. She never was. The room might have thought this was a casual exchange. But inside, and was already considering contingencies, evaluating damage control measures, and envisioning the eventual fallout if this remark ever reached Harry, the media, or worse, Andrew himself. Let me ask you something. Have you ever had a conversation where the silence between words says more than the words themselves? That's what this was. Every pause, every glance, every slight inflection carried weight. A dozen palace staff could feel it without understanding why. And that's when things began to move. And departed quietly, but her mind didn't leave the corridor. The statement, "This will not end well," wasn't a throwaway line. It was a calculation, a premonition, a signal that this whisper, seemingly harmless in tone, had the power to ignite chaos. Meanwhile, Fergie lingered, sensing the gravity she had unintentionally unleashed. The playful smirk faded. What began as a casual remark now had consequences she hadn't fully considered. And she knew, instinctively, that if Harry heard this before the story could be contained, it wouldn't just be gossip. It would be an emotional grenade. And that's exactly what happened. Because the next day, that whisper traveled faster than anyone anticipated. Palace staff discussed it quietly in the background. A footman passed a fragment to an assistant. An aide repeated a part of the exchange to someone on the other side of the Atlantic. Within hours, the gossip had crossed oceans, reaching California, directly into Harry's hands. But here's the crucial part. The conversation between Fergie and Anne wasn't just about the past. It wasn't just about Meghan's alleged yacht connections or her social circles before marrying Harry. It was about perception, about control, about the monarchy's ability to manage narratives. And Anne understood this better than anyone. She knew that Harry was not just a prince. He was a man with his own emotions, biases, and history of protective impulses. And if he ever learned of this whisper in the wrong context, the fallout could be catastrophic. And yet, the whisper reached him anyway. Harry read the message late at night, alone in the quiet of his Montecito home. His first reaction wasn't anger, it was disbelief. Then confusion. Then a sense of betrayal that crept in slowly, like cold water. Because in that moment, he was faced with a question he had never wanted to ask, and a fear he had long ignored. Could someone he loved, trusted, and believed in completely have secrets that touched even the edges of scandal? And as he read the words yacht circles and Sarah Ferguson together, the dam broke. Doubt, fear, and anger collided in his mind. The very foundation of trust, carefully built over years, suddenly seemed less certain. And that's when he called Meghan. The conversation that followed wasn't just tense. It wasn't just uncomfortable. It was electric, explosive, charged with the energy of everything that had been left unsaid between them for months. Everything that had simmered quietly in the background of their marriage, waiting for the perfect trigger to surface, finally erupted. And what Meghan heard in Harry's voice, the first tremor of doubt, the subtle edge of accusation, shook her to her core. Because for the first time, the past she thought she controlled wasn't under her control anymore. And for the first time, Harry asked the question that would change the night, the marriage, and their lives forever. But that question, that single spark, would not end there. What followed next? The confrontation, the accusations, the panic, the desperate attempts to defend herself, would escalate beyond what anyone could predict. And in true palace fashion, It all began with a whisper. It wasn't meant for him. That much is clear. The whisper was casual, a comment exchanged between two royal insiders in a hallway miles and continents away. But somehow, through the invisible threads of palace gossip, miscommunication, and the ever-watchful eyes of aides, it landed directly in Harry's hands. The message pinged quietly on his phone. Just a few lines, almost innocuous, but heavy with implication. Sarah Ferguson mentioned Meghan. Yacht circles, something about Andrew. Nothing more, nothing less. But Harry didn't need more. He had imagination, intuition, and a lifetime of living with suspicion when it came to palace intrigue. And instantly, the room around him seemed to shrink. The air in his Montecito home grew thick. The quiet hum of California crickets outside was drowned out by the rapid beating of his heart. He read the message twice, 3 times, and still couldn't process it fully. He wasn't angry yet. Not really. He was confused. Conflicted. 1,000 questions barreled through his mind. Who did Fergie mean? Was it true? Why would someone bring this up now? And the most dangerous question of all, why hadn't Meghan told him about it? Let's pause here. Ask yourself, have you ever received a piece of information about someone you love that shakes the foundation of everything you believed about them? The kind of information that doesn't just surprise you but unsettles every memory, every interaction, every trust you thought was absolute? That was Harry in that moment. He paced. He cursed under his breath. He stared at the ceiling. The house felt too small, too quiet, too vulnerable. The pool in the backyard reflected the moonlight, but he couldn't see the calm. Not when a storm was building inside him. The rumor, if it could even be called that, was subtle. Fergie's wording was deliberate. She didn't say Meghan slept with Andrew outright. She hinted. She suggested. She insinuated. And insinuations are far more dangerous than clear statements because they force the listener to fill in the blanks themselves. And Harry's mind did exactly that. He remembered moments in Meghan's past, nights at galas, parties, charity events. He remembered photographs he had seen, stories he had been told. He remembered the controlled image of Meghan that she presented to the world. Perfect, composed, untouchable. But now, those memories became a puzzle with missing pieces. Pieces he suddenly feared were being manipulated to fit a narrative that he didn't understand. He called Meghan immediately. Not a text, not an email, a call. Because instinctively, he knew that if this was true, or even partially true, he needed answers now. And if it wasn't true, he needed reassurance immediately. When Meghan answered, her voice was calm, but carried a hint of weariness. Harry? Is everything okay? No, everything was not okay. He struggled to articulate what he had just read, what he had just internalized. Fergie, she said something. About you, about yacht circles, something about Andrew, he said, his voice tight. His words rushed, clipped, sharp, not fully formed, not fully controlled. And Meghan? Meghan's reaction was exactly what he feared. A pause, a sharp intake of breath. Her eyes, even on a video call, flickered with a flash of something he hadn't seen before, panic. Panic. Not denial. Not anger. Panic. And that tiny flicker set off something in Harry that he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of betrayal. Not by her actions, not by the past, but by the secrecy, by the parts of her life he had never been allowed to see. For Harry, secrecy was dangerous. He had lived through decades of it. He had experienced the fallout of hidden truths about his mother. He had witnessed the devastation secrets could cause. And now, even in the sanctuary of California, he felt that old, familiar dread creeping back. The conversation was strained. Words collided. Misunderstandings amplified. Harry asked the questions he had never wanted to ask, but now couldn't avoid. Why didn't you tell me about this? When did this happen? Who? Meghan tried to answer. She tried to contextualize. She tried to calm him. But the momentum had already shifted. Harry's mind raced faster than any explanation could travel. The whisper from the palace had metastasized into full-blown suspicion. Let's think about this for a moment. The power of a rumor, especially in a high-stakes environment like this, isn't just in the content. It's in the timing. It's in the delivery. It's in the way it lands in the wrong person's hands at exactly the wrong moment. In Harry's case, the timing couldn't have been worse. He had just returned from a day filled with meetings, charity engagements, and reminders of how public life never truly stops. even in self-imposed exile. He was tired, emotionally vulnerable, and already carrying a weight of frustration about his media portrayal, his financial pressures, and the ongoing tension between his family and Meghan. The whisper hit him at a time when his defenses were lowest, and that's when his fear turned to anger. A low, simmering anger that was quiet at first but threatening to explode. He thought of Fergie, speaking in her casual, almost flippant way, knowing exactly how her words would land. He thought of, and her calm, stone-faced warning echoing in his mind. And he thought of Meghan, whose calm exterior now seemed fragile, as though the slightest push could shatter it. Harry's internal monologue was brutal. He replayed every interaction, every detail he had ever seen about Meghan's past, and began connecting dots, some that weren't even connected. He imagined scenarios he had no evidence for. He wondered whether his trust had been misplaced, whether his judgment had been clouded by love, admiration, and a desire to protect her at all costs. And the kicker? Harry wasn't just thinking about the past. He was thinking about the future. Because rumors, once they take hold, don't just vanish. They metastasize. They spread. They influence public perception, the press, even potential business deals. And for a man who had experienced the tabloid press's cruelty firsthand, that was terrifying. The call with Meghan became tense, teetering on the edge of confrontation. His questions became sharper, more pointed. Her reassurances became more defensive. And in those moments, the emotional stakes escalated rapidly. Every word, every inflection, every pause carried weight. And both of them felt it. By the end of the call, neither was fully calm. The seed of doubt had been planted. And once that seed grows in Harry's mind, it doesn't stop with questions. It grows into scenarios, possibilities, fears, the kind that make even the strongest person question everything they thought they knew. And just as Harry was about to hang up, a thought struck him. One single, horrifying thought that would change the trajectory of the evening. What if this isn't just Fergie's whisper? What if it's more? What if it's true? And it was in that instant, with adrenaline coursing through his veins, that he realized he needed clarity. Not later, not eventually, but immediately. He was about to confront Meghan with the one question he had never dared to ask. A question that would redefine the night, their marriage, and their sense of trust in ways neither of them could have predicted. But what came next? The confrontation, the accusation, the shock, would be far worse than anything he imagined. It was a photograph. Not a file. Not a document. Not a message with vague insinuations. Just a photograph. Yet in its simplicity, it carried the weight of every rumor, every doubt, every unanswered question Harry had harbored since reading the whispered note from palace staff. The photograph appeared suddenly on his phone, pushed through a secure channel by someone who claimed to know the truth. Its sender was anonymous, but the timing was uncanny, as if fate itself had conspired to place it there, moments after Fergie's whisper had already set Harry's mind on fire. He didn't know what to expect. Maybe a candid image of Meghan at a social gathering. Perhaps some innocuous yacht party photo meant to stir curiosity, but nothing more. Yet the moment he opened it, his pulse spiked, and his stomach twisted into a knot. The photo showed Meghan, unmistakably, on a yacht. The backdrop was unmistakable. Clear blue waters, a sleek deck, and shadows suggesting an evening party under the stars. She was laughing, radiant, carefree, the Meghan everyone knew from public appearances. Yet there was something in the image that immediately set off alarms in Harry's mind. She wasn't alone. A figure, partially obscured, lingered close, someone Harry recognized from the royal orbit. Someone whose presence should have never intersected with Meghan in this way. His heart sank. The implications were immediate, unavoidable, and horrifying. Harry stared at the photograph over and over. Each glance brought a new layer of unease. The position of Meghan's body, the angle of the light, the way her hand rested on the railing, subtle but loaded with suggestion. The image was carefully framed, almost cinematic, capturing a moment that felt intimate and yet public enough for anyone with knowledge to recognize. Ask yourself this. If you were presented with a single piece of evidence that seemed to contradict everything you believed about someone you loved, could you remain calm? Could you trust context? Could you separate fact from fear? Harry couldn't. Not then. Not at that precise moment when adrenaline, suspicion, and protectiveness collided. He leaned back in his chair, phone trembling in his hand, and tried to process the cascade of thoughts racing through his mind. How long had this been happening? Was it recent? Was it before their marriage? Or had this world of yachts and elites somehow extended into the years they had shared together? And, most dangerous of all, was he the last to know because Meghan had chosen to hide it from him deliberately? The photograph did not exist in isolation. In Harry's mind, it was tied to the whisper from Fergie, to the quiet warnings from and to all the subtle hints he had unconsciously noticed over the past months and years. Every delayed reply, every slight omission in conversation, every media narrative Meghan had controlled now coalesced into a single, terrifying image. Harry's first instinct was anger. The kind of anger that rises unbidden, sharp and hot, burning through rational thought. But anger quickly gave way to fear. Not just fear of the photograph's content, but fear of what it represented. The loss of certainty, the fracture of trust, the possibility that his judgment had been flawed. And then came confusion, because the photograph was ambiguous. The figure beside Meghan was partially obscured, their identity hinted at but not confirmed. Harry's mind raced through names, faces, rumors he had heard in passing, all connecting back to the whispers about yacht circles, about Fergie, about Andrew. The combination of ambiguity and suggestion was deadly. Humans are wired to fill in blanks when information is incomplete, and Harry's imagination, fueled by love, protectiveness, and a lifetime of witnessing scandal, supplied the blanks with the worst possible scenarios. It was this combination, photo plus whisper plus intuition, that drove him to confront Meghan, not calmly, not rationally, but with an intensity that left no room for denial, explanation, or evasion. He called her immediately. The phone rang, and each second felt like an eternity. When Meghan answered, her voice was calm but measured, masking the storm she likely felt behind the surface. "Harry," she said, casual, almost unaware of the tempest that had just hit him. He didn't answer. He couldn't. Instead, he stared at the photograph once more, feeling the weight of it settle deep in his chest. Then, in a voice that trembled between fury and disbelief, he demanded, "Who is that with you?" The conversation spiraled quickly. Meghan attempted to contextualize, to explain, to minimize the significance. But Harry's mind was already racing ahead, connecting dots, imagining scenarios, and reacting to every possible outcome in real time. Every reassurance she offered collided with the image, creating more tension rather than resolving it. Ask yourself this. What would you do if the person you trusted implicitly suddenly seemed to exist in a world you didn't know? A world of secrecy, exclusivity, and insinuation? That's what Harry faced. And in moments like this, even the strongest people, the people who spend their lives managing public perception, royal protocol, and personal composure, can break. The photograph was more than just a picture. It was a symbol, a trigger, a bridge between past whispers and present reality. And for Harry, it demanded an answer he had no choice but to seek. He pressed Meghan further, his voice rising, a mixture of frustration and fear. The trust that had been the foundation of their partnership felt fragile, threatened by a single image that implied so much yet confirmed so little. Each explanation she offered seemed rehearsed, measured, carefully curated, exactly the traits that now fueled his suspicion. And then came the thought that would haunt him for the remainder of the night. What if this photograph isn't just a memory? What if it's evidence of connections and actions that could have repercussions far beyond their personal lives? Connections that could draw them into scandals, media firestorms, and palace judgments that would be impossible to escape? The weight of that thought pressed down on him. It was suffocating, and it became clear that this photograph, combined with the whisper from Fergie, had initiated a sequence of events that was no longer containable. It demanded confrontation. It demanded clarity. And it demanded answers that could not wait another second. Harry's pulse quickened. His breathing shortened. His hands trembled as he typed a message to Meghan, urging her to call immediately. The tension was unbearable. Every second that passed without her voice deepened the uncertainty, widened the gap between assumption and truth. And Meghan, on the other end, sensed the shift. She had expected curiosity, questions, maybe even concern. But the intensity, the rawness, the underlying fear in Harry's voice, that was something entirely different. Something unprecedented. Something that would redefine their evening, their dialogue, and possibly their relationship itself. Because this wasn't just about a photograph. It wasn't about a yacht. It wasn't about whispers. It was about trust, about secrets, about fears that had been buried too long, now clawing to the surface in the most public and personal way possible. And in that moment, with the photograph glowing on Harry's phone screen, the confrontation began. Ask yourself this. Have you ever been confronted with a question that strikes at the very core of who you are, who you've been, and who the people around you believe you to be? The kind of question that's impossible to answer without risking misunderstanding, judgment, or disbelief. That's what Meghan faced. She tried to reassure him, tried to redirect the conversation to calm the escalating tension. Harry, this is ridiculous. You know me. You know who I am. This is a baseless accusation. But Harry's emotional state had surpassed rational debate. His heart was racing. His mind was flooded with images, whispers, and possibilities. Trust had been tested, shaken, and now demanded proof. And in the absence of absolute reassurance, doubt grew like wildfire. The confrontation escalated quickly. Words were exchanged in rapid succession. Accusations, denials, explanations, interruptions, a dance of emotions that neither could control. Harry's fear of betrayal clashed violently with Meghan's fear of being misunderstood. Every detail mattered. Every hesitation, every glance, every micro-expression became evidence in Harry's mind. And every word Meghan spoke, even when truthful, was filtered through the lens of suspicion. It was here, in this explosion of emotion, that Harry realized something terrifying. This wasn't just about a past rumor or a photograph. This was about the fragility of trust, about the precarious balance of love and suspicion, about how easily a single whisper could destabilize years of connection, care, and commitment. And Meghan, for her part, understood the stakes. She had navigated media storms before, public scrutiny, and personal attacks, but nothing compared to the intensity of Harry's gaze in this moment. His love, his fear, his anger, all converged into a force that left her scrambling for clarity, for words, for composure. Every sentence became a battlefield. Every explanation became ammunition. And in the midst of it, Harry asked himself, and implicitly, Meghan too, the unspoken question that lingered beyond the words. Can we survive this? Can love endure when suspicion strikes at the heart? And as the argument drew on, heated and relentless, one thing became clear. The question itself, did you sleep with Andrew, was only the beginning. It had unlocked a chain reaction that would expose old wounds, resurrect hidden insecurities, and force both Harry and Meghan to confront aspects of themselves and each other that had been buried beneath the surface. And then, just when it seemed the storm might reach a temporary lull, a new factor entered the conversation. Something unexpected, something that neither Harry nor Meghan had anticipated. A memory, a fragment of evidence, a detail from the photograph, previously overlooked, that reignited the argument with renewed intensity. And in that instant, Harry realized the confrontation wasn't just emotional. It was personal. It was exposing layers of the past and present that could not be ignored. Every word, every pause, every look became a weapon, a shield, and a mirror, reflecting fears they had both tried to avoid. But what came next? Meghan's revelation, the piece of her past she had kept hidden, and the reaction it triggered in Harry, would escalate the evening to heights neither of them could have anticipated. Before Meghan Markle was a duchess, before she married Harry, before the cameras followed her every move, there was another world. A world of luxury, exclusivity, and circles where the elite mingled with abandon, away from public scrutiny. It's a world most people only see in movies, Instagram posts, or tabloids. Yachts gliding over turquoise waters, champagne flowing under the golden sunset, whispered conversations with names that carried influence and power. And Meghan, she was there, not as a royal observer, not as a passive attendee, but as someone who, at the time, embraced the lifestyle, the connections, and the glamour. She navigated these social circles with the grace, charm, and intelligence that would later become her trademarks. Yet in this context, they also carried risk. Because in the world of elite yachts and private gatherings, rumors are currency, secrets are power, and every glance, every laugh, every photograph can be weaponized years later. Sarah Ferguson knew this. That's why her whisper had landed with such force. The term, yacht circles, wasn't casual. It carried implications, associations, and innuendos. And for Harry, who had just seen the photograph and heard the whisper, it was like a key turning in a lock, opening a door he had never wanted to explore. But Meghan had always believed those years were safely behind her. Carefully curated narratives, selective stories, and the controlled transparency she practiced with the press had, in her mind, buried any risk of exposure. She thought the world she had left behind was gone, inaccessible, irrelevant. She was wrong. Because in the palace, history never truly disappears. It waits. It lurks in whispers, photographs, and the casual commentary of relatives who know exactly what buttons to push. And in this case, it had been Sarah Ferguson who pressed them. The yacht past wasn't just a social anecdote. It carried potential connections to people still in the public eye, including Prince Andrew, whose own scandals had kept him in the spotlight for decades. Even an indirect association with him could spark speculation, judgment, and scandal, precisely the environment Harry feared. Harry didn't need to hear every detail of Meghan's past to feel the weight of it. The photograph alone was enough to trigger suspicion. But the context, the whispered hints, the subtle glances in the photograph, the knowledge that Meghan had moved in circles overlapping with powerful, and sometimes controversial, figures, intensified the fear. He remembered seeing her in photos at exclusive yacht parties, sometimes posed with influential figures, sometimes candidly laughing with people whose names carried weight in ways he hadn't understood at the time. These images were curated, intentional, professional. Yet now, in the glare of suspicion, they seemed almost conspiratorial. Meghan, for her part, tried to reassure him. She explained that those events were public enough that anyone could have attended, that friendships and connections were part of professional networking, and that nothing untoward had ever happened. But Harry's mind wasn't listening. Not yet. Because the problem wasn't the past itself. It was trust. It was the fear that she had hidden something, that she had actively chosen to withhold a part of her life from him, despite their closeness, their love, and their shared responsibilities. And in a relationship as public and scrutinized as theirs, omissions can feel like betrayals, even when they aren't. Harry paced the room, phone in hand, revisiting every memory, every photograph, every snippet of gossip he had encountered over the years. Each image of Meghan smiling on a yacht, each story about elite parties, each anecdote about her social connections now seemed loaded with significance. And every explanation Meghan offered felt insufficient, incomplete, filtered through the lens of someone trying to control perception. Ask yourself this. What would you do if the person you trusted implicitly had a past that suddenly felt like a threat? A past that intersected with people whose names alone sparked scandal? How would you process the fear, the doubt, the questions you didn't even know how to articulate? That's the position Harry was in. And for Meghan, the weight of this confrontation was equally devastating. She had believed her past was neutral, irrelevant to her current life. She had thought she could navigate public perception with charm, intelligence, and strategic communication. She had counted on the fact that Harry, who loved her deeply, would see her for who she was now, not for who she had been. But the whisper, the photograph, the fear, it changed everything. It transformed a past she had thought safely hidden into a present crisis. And the irony was cruel. The very skills Meghan had used to build her life, charisma, adaptability, and social intelligence, now worked against her. They gave her enemies and allies alike the tools to interpret every detail, to suggest connections, to imply indiscretions that had never existed. It was a trap that had been lying in wait, invisible until the right moment. And that moment had arrived. Harry's questions grew sharper. Who was there? What was happening? Why didn't you tell me about any of this? His voice carried tension, fear, and desperation. Meghan tried to respond calmly, detailing her perspective, emphasizing the professional and social nature of the gatherings. She explained the context, the environment, and the people, insisting there was nothing more to it. But Harry's gaze, his tone, and the emotion behind his words conveyed one clear message. Context alone wasn't enough. He needed proof. He needed certainty. And in that need for certainty, the conversation escalated. The stakes went beyond the photograph or the whisper. It became a confrontation about honesty, transparency, and trust, the very pillars of their relationship. Meghan felt the tension rising. She had always managed the press, social situations, and public perception with calculated grace. But this confrontation was different. It wasn't a public audience. There were no cameras, no controlled narrative. Only Harry. And Harry, for the first time, questioned her in a way that she could not navigate with charm alone. The yacht past, the social circles, the whispers, all converged into a single, inescapable question. Could Harry trust her? Could she maintain her composure under the weight of his suspicion? Could they survive this intersection of past and present without permanent damage? And the answer, at that moment, was unclear. Because Harry wasn't just asking questions about yachts, parties, or whispers. He was testing the foundation of their entire relationship. And Meghan, however composed she appeared, understood that one misstep, one hesitation, one misunderstood phrase could tip the scales irreparably. The tension was palpable. The room felt smaller. The distance between them seemed wider. Each word, each glance, each carefully chosen phrase became loaded with meaning. And neither of them could escape the gravity of the moment. But just as Meghan began to form a clear response, another complication emerged. Something subtle yet undeniable. A detail in the photograph, a name she had forgotten to mention, a connection she had assumed irrelevant. All of it coalesced in Harry's mind, reigniting fear, doubt, and suspicion. And in that instant, the confrontation escalated again, reaching emotional heights neither had anticipated. The past they both thought safely behind them now demanded attention, explanation, and resolution. And what Meghan had hoped would remain buried, a part of her life long forgotten, seemingly irrelevant to the world she had built with Harry, was now front and center. But what came next, a phone call, a confession, a piece of evidence, would push them beyond confrontation into territory neither could have imagined. The room was still vibrating with tension when Harry's phone buzzed again. He hadn't even recovered from the confrontation with Meghan. His pulse was still pounding, his thoughts were still chaotic, and the echo of his own question, "Did you sleep with Andrew?" still hung in the air like smoke after a fire. He didn't want another message. He didn't want another photo. He didn't want another rumor. But he got something far worse. A call from a number he didn't recognize. And normally, he would have ignored it. Especially now, especially with his emotions spiraling. But something about the timing, the urgency, the faint vibration against his palm, pulled his attention. He answered, "Harry, it's me." For a moment, Harry couldn't place the voice. It was smooth, practiced, confident, the type of voice belonging to people who lived in the corridors of Hollywood, where everything was performance and every sentence was shaped by strategy. Then it clicked. This was one of Meghan's older contacts. Someone from the Hollywood world she rarely spoke about. Someone she had described as an acquaintance, a business connection, someone who used to know people. Harry had never thought much of him. But now, the timing made the hairs on the back of his neck rise. "What is it?" Harry asked, voice tight. The insider exhaled sharply, the kind of breath someone takes before dropping a bomb. "I heard what's happening," he said. "You need to listen to me. There are people talking. Not just in London. Not just in the palace. Here. In Hollywood." Harry stiffened. Hollywood. The place where Meghan used to live, breathe, and build her identity. The place that had shaped her more than any royal institution ever could. The place filled with people who remembered her before the Duchess era, before the royal wedding, before the fame sharpened into something else entirely. What people? Harry demanded. There was a pause, too long. A hesitation too calculated. The ones who knew her back then. The ones who remember certain yachts. There it was again. That word. That cursed word. Yachts. It hit Harry like a physical blow. His breath caught. His fingers tightened around the phone. He didn't speak, so the insider continued. "You think Fergie's whisper was random? You think it's only circulating inside the palace? Harry, it's not. People out here remember. And they've been talking ever since Meghan became, well, Meghan. Harry closed his eyes. He wanted to believe this was exaggeration, paranoia, opportunism. But after everything he had seen tonight, the whisper, the photograph, Meghan's hesitation, this didn't feel random. It felt targeted, coordinated, inevitable. What exactly are they saying? Harry asked. The insider sighed again, this time with a mixture of discomfort and resignation. Some of them say Meghan wasn't just networking back then. They say she was part of a curated guest list. You know what that means. Harry swallowed hard. The implication was sharp, cruel, insinuating. Exactly the kind of thing tabloids would devour and twist mercilessly. But Harry needed clarity. Desperately. Curated how he pushed. Curated as in selected for events. Invited for being attractive, charismatic, and socially useful. Those yacht gatherings weren't casual. They were strategic, for the men and for the women involved. Harry's jaw clenched so hard it hurt. So you're telling me Meghan was chosen? He asked. Harry, listen. I'm not saying anything happened. I'm telling you what people remember. And I'm telling you that some of the men on those yachts had connections to royalty, to billionaires, to political families. Harry felt the floors shifting beneath him. Royalty, billionaires, political families. This wasn't just about Meghan's past. This wasn't just about rumors. This was about what those rumors could become in the hands of tabloids, palace adversaries, or opportunistic outsiders. He hated every second of this. He hated the insinuations. He hated the panic crawling up his spine. He hated that he didn't know what to believe. He took a breath, trying to steady himself. Why are you telling me this now? The insider hesitated again. Because I heard what the palace is doing. I know about the whisper. And if this continues, someone is going to bring up the yacht stories publicly. Once that happens, Harry, you won't be able to contain it. Harry felt his stomach drop. What do you mean contain it? Exactly what it sounds like, the insider replied. There are people, journalists, ex-industry workers, former guests, who would love to drop something like this at the worst possible time. And with Prince Andrew's name floating around again, he trailed off. Harry didn't need him to finish. He knew exactly what the insider was suggesting. What does Andrew have to do with any of this? Harry asked slowly. The insider didn't answer immediately. When he finally did, his voice was low. Some of those yachts. Andrew had been on them. Not at the same time as Meghan, not that I know of. But the overlap in circles was enough. Enough to spark suspicion. Enough for people to draw conclusions. Enough for the wrong whisper to turn into a global headline. Harry's breath caught in his throat. That was it. That was the connection Sarah Ferguson had hinted at. That was the implication she had dangled so casually. And now, hearing it from someone in Hollywood, someone who had no obligation to protect the royal family, made it real. Dangerously real. Harry rubbed his temples, trying to process everything. Trying to connect dots that seemed to multiply with each passing minute. Why tell me this now, he repeated. Because, the insider said quietly, I owed Meghan once. She helped someone close to me when she didn't have to. And I don't want her blindsided if this comes out again. You need to stay ahead of it. Harry was silent. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know if he was grateful or furious. He didn't know whether this call helped or made everything worse. The insider spoke again, softer now. Harry, I don't know what's true and what's rumor. But I do know this. The circles she moved in back then weren't innocent. They were glamorous, yes. Fun, yes. But also predatory. And those worlds don't forget. Not when someone becomes global news. And Meghan became global news. Harry's throat tightened. Do you have proof? He whispered. There was a tense pause. No. Only stories. Only whispers. But that type of thing never stays buried. Harry felt like he had been punched. Whispers. Stories. Rumors. That's how it always began in the royal family. And those whispers eventually destroyed reputations, relationships, and lives. He thought of his mother. He thought of Meghan. He thought of himself. The insider continued. Harry. Talk to her. Not in anger. Not in accusation. But honestly, there are details you might not know. Not because she hid them, but because she didn't think they mattered anymore. But they matter now. And if you don't hear the truth from her, someone else will twist the story before it reaches you. Harry's heart sank. Because that was exactly what was happening. The story was twisting, shifting, escalating. And he was losing control of it. The insider ended with one final warning. And Harry, if Andrew's name starts getting pulled into this again, whether deserved or not, Prepare yourself. The blowback will be massive. Be ready. The call ended. Harry stared at his phone as if it were a bomb that had just stopped ticking. Everything he feared was multiplying. Everything he doubted was growing. Everything he trusted felt suddenly fragile. And Meghan had no idea this call had happened. He exhaled shakily and realized something chilling. This wasn't just a rumor anymore. This was a coordinated storm, building momentum, merging with other whispers, and picking up speed. Something was coming. Something big. Something he couldn't stop alone. And he wasn't ready. But what came next, when Prince Andrew's name surfaced again in a way no one expected, would send the entire situation spiraling into chaos.